neighborhoods in Los Angeles have some pretty heavy updates if they have residential income properties in Los Angeles. And I'm going to give you those updates on the new RSO ordinance, which is 1877-37. To begin, in Los Angeles City, so this ordinance applies to Los Angeles cities, not the county, not all the other cities, just LA City itself. LA City has a rent control ordinance. So if you have multifamily and some condos that were built on or before October 1st, 1978 or older, those are subject to rent control. Rent control in Los Angeles City, virtually everybody knows about. A lot of units are subject to rent control. There is a gap between those properties and units that were newer, single family residences and condos that were newer. There's a state rent control, and that covers multifamily up to a certain point. I'm not going to go into that. That's AB 1482. So then there's a further gap between those units, which is some of the property in Los Angeles City covers, and then still AB 1482 doesn't cover single family residences, still doesn't cover certain condos. LA City made its own sort of rent control on all residential rental units, whether it's a house, a condo, multifamily. All residential units now have some form of rent control. Now, for the ones that are not subject to what we know as the RSO, those ones landlords can't prevent rent increases, so they can't control the rent increases. Those are subject to either the state rent control or, in like the instance of single family residences or condos, the city can't prevent landlords from raising the rent on those ones because there's not a control on that. What they have controlled is your ability to evict. So that's what this video is going to talk about. LA City now has on all residential rentals restrictions on eviction. So you can no longer end a tenancy unless you have cause or you have no fault just cause. So the difference between cause and no fault just cause. So cause is tenant hasn't paid rent, tenant is creating nuisances, tenant is violating some sort of law, doing some sort of illegal activity on the property. Those are the three main causes. They have made a new minimum threshold for rent. Rent now used to be that you could evict even if the tenant owed a penny. Now there's a minimum threshold for how much money the tenant must owe before you can file an eviction. And that goes into effect, I believe, March 27th, 2023. So the minimum is based on HUD, which HUD is the federal government, Housing and Urban Development. For that, they have HUD will give the rents for certain areas in the country. So in this case, Los Angeles metro area, HUD goes 1 bedroom, apartments or houses are worth one amount, 2 bedroom worth another amount, 3 bedroom, etc. The city says based on HUD, if the tenant doesn't owe this minimum amount for the number of bedrooms in their unit or in their house, then you can't give a 3-day notice. Now, if the tenant does meet this, let's say their rent is, above this HUD threshold and they haven't paid rent for 1 month, then you can serve a 3-day notice. All 3-day notices in LA City have to be filed with LAHD, the Los Angeles Housing Department, which used to be HCIDLA, and they rebranded. So now all 3-day notices, once you serve them on a tenant, have to be filed with housing within 3 business days. All of this stuff, I'll put links to the ordinance and to the website that talks about how you file the notices. So that's, this new prong. So you have to have cause to evict a tenant. If the cause is they haven't paid rent, then they have to meet a minimum threshold for how much rent they owe. The next thing, let's say you have a no fault reason to evict. No fault meaning the tenant hasn't done anything wrong, hasn't violated the lease, doesn't owe rent, isn't doing anything illegal, but you want to get the rental back. That's typically in the event of you want to own or occupy it yourself or a qualified family member. You are doing substantial remodels. They're going to take longer than 30 days and the tenant has opted to move out in lieu of being relocated because they're going to be out of their unit for a long time and they want permanent relocation. The other one would be to comply with the government order. The government says, hey, the tenant can no longer live here. They have to move out. Or you Ellis Act the property, which means you're taking the property completely off the market. That's typically if you as a landlord want to not rent anymore, you want to get out of the rental game, or you're demolishing the building because you plan to redevelop it into something else. Usually you demolish it because you're going to redevelop. Those are called no fault just causes. There's a few more other ones, but those are the main ones. So in that case, the tenant gets mandatory relocation. That is predetermined by LA City. They already have a chart for it. So that applies to all residential properties. So now if before you could, like on houses, you could give a 60-day notice, tenant would have to move out. Can't do that anymore. Now you have to have either a fault, they've done something wrong, or no fault just cause, you have some other reason and you have to pay relocation. There's another relocation and it's different than the relocation is talked about. And this one is the economic impact. This gets triggered if you raise the rent more than 5% plus the change in CPI or 10%, whichever one is lower. If you raise rent more than 10% and you're allowed to do that. So like rent controlled units, you can't raise rent, but in these other properties, let's say you can raise rent and you can raise it more than 10% because that part is not restricted. By the way, caveat, if you're going to raise rent, you should talk to an eviction attorney who specializes in evictions because they tend to know how much you can or cannot raise rent. So before you raise it, you might want to talk to an eviction attorney because they'll have likely a better understanding of what you can raise rent, when you can raise rent. Because there are still some eviction moratoriums at the time of doing this video that are restricting rent increases. If you raise it more than 10%, then the tenant can say, I don't want to pay it. It's too high. I want to move out. You have to pay them relocation. And it's an amount different than the other relocation. So there's two different amounts. And this is outlined in a posting that I'm going to get into in a second, but it's outlined in a 2-page posting that you have to put on properties that are subject to this. Next, there is this posting. So if you have rent controlled building, you're typically familiar with the notice of this property is subject to the rent stabilization ordinance. That's, I believe, a 1-page posting. It's been a while since I've looked. I think it's 1 page. It usually goes by the mailboxes and it notifies that the property is subject to rent control for LA City. Now, all these other properties that have tenants in them have to have this new posting, and it's a 2-page posting, and it talks about what the tenant's rights are. You also have to serve on the tenants this 14-page ordinance, 1877-37. You have to give the tenants that ordinance and serve it on them so that they can read all about it. They can read it, pretty convoluted. There's some explanations about it. This video is kind of a broad overview of what's in that ordinance. So then that's the next thing. So before you ever give any notice to tenants about anything, you got to post this 2-page posting on the property in a common area. So if it's like a house, you could probably post it outside near where they probably walk every day, or you could post it inside, maybe by the door. That's kind of a common area, maybe in the kitchen, maybe in a hallway somewhere. You post it in a common area that everyone will see it, and then you serve this ordinance. Then you can serve notices after that. Those are the main components of what goes into this new ordinance. It's, if you are familiar with rent control, you have rent control properties as we typically knew it, then you're going to be probably somewhat familiar with all these restrictions. If you didn't have any rent control properties, this is probably going to be a surprise to you, and it's a little intro to what it's like being under rent control. These units are, if people talk about it, they kind of refer it as the non-RSO rent control. So it's the rent control on the units that were not subject to the regular rent control. So it is a little convoluted. Typically, these things tend to have names. This new ordinance doesn't really have a name. The AB 1482 was the Tenant Protections Act of 2019. It has like a name. This one doesn't, so it's a little confusing. But I suggest that everybody read up on it. It's 14 pages. I know it's a lot. It's thick, it's dense, a lot of legalese. We should read about it. You definitely should read the 2-page mandatory posting. It does a decent job of at least outlining pretty much what the ordinance is saying and what the relocation amounts are. If you're a landlord, and let's say you have a house that you now want to sell or you want to move back into, you have completely different restrictions on you now than you had previously. I always tell anybody, if you're gonna do any sort of eviction notice, you should definitely talk to an eviction attorney about it. If you want to do some sort of buyout, that's also now somewhat of an option that landlords pursue in light of this. If they want to get the unit back and they want to get it back maybe faster, there's a premium for doing a buyout, but that's also another alternative. But I definitely do see this new rent control not really doing much in the way of changing how landlords landlord for houses, for condos, or for apartments that weren't subject to previous rent control. I just do see that this is going to make buyouts more of a thing than they already were. So that is the summary on that. I will leave links below for pertinent information so that you can read up on it. I do suggest that you read up on it. Thank you for watching, and I hope this was helpful.